It's hard to name the single most important archaeological discovery ever made. But if what matters to you is, for example, understanding the history of Latin American civilizations, then Machu Picchu in Peru is probably the most important discovery for you. If you're more interested in China, especially its military and artistic history, then one of the most significant discoveries is the Terracotta Army. From the perspective of geoarchaeology, one of the most fascinating finds is Pompeii in Italy. However, if what you seek is one of the greatest turning points in human cultural evolution, then that would be Göbekli Tepe. Built roughly 11,600 years ago, this remarkable structure makes the 4,000-year-old Egyptian pyramids and the 5,000-year-old Stonehenge look almost recent by comparison. But why did our ancestors feel the need to build such a monument? Was it humanity's first attempt at constructing a permanent dwelling? Or was it a temple where they offered sacrifices to their gods? Or could there be something even more mysterious, perhaps involving aliens? What is the true secret of Göbekli Tepe? Göbekli Tepe is located 15 kilometers northeast of the city center of Şanlıurfa, and it was officially discovered in 1994 by the German archaeologist and historian Klaus Schmidt. Of course, the local people already knew about this hill. In Kurdish, it was called Gire Mirazan, meaning Hill of Wishes, and it was believed to be a sacred place. Back in 1963, a joint team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University had already noted the hill's potential archaeological importance. Under the leadership of American archaeologist Peter Benedict, researchers found stone tools on the surface and correctly identified them as belonging to the pre-pottery Neolithic period around 10,000–11,000 years ago. But the problem was, at the time, no one realized they had stumbled upon an ancient settlement. It simply seemed impossible that nomadic tribes from such an early period could have built a permanent site. They even found several large stones in the area, some of which turned out to be the upper surfaces of Göbekli Tepe's famous T-shaped pillars. Here's how they looked while still buried underground. The experts literally walked over them, seeing only the flat tops of the stones. Unfortunately, they mistook these horizontal stones for tombstones. From that, they concluded the prehistoric remains in the area had later been overlaid by Byzantine-era graves. This assumption made sense at the time. The land around Göbekli Tepe had been used as farmland for centuries. Local farmers, unaware of the archaeological treasure beneath their feet, often moved, broke, or plowed through the stones, altering the upper layers of the site. It would be unfair to blame them. There was no way they could have known what lay below. Finally, in 1994, while searching for a new excavation site, Klaus Schmidt from the German Archaeological Institute came across the 1963 report and realized it could describe something extraordinary. He decided to travel to the region. When he met Mahmut Yildiz, the owner of the land, Schmidt learned that the Yildiz family had already found numerous archaeological artifacts around the hill and had regularly reported them to the local museum. While exploring the hill and its surroundings, Schmidt noticed limestone blocks similar to those excavated at Novala Chori, just a few kilometers away, and it instantly sparked an idea. Re-examining the 1963 report in light of this new insight, Schmidt, with the support of Adnan Musur, then director of the Şanlıurfa Museum, and Harold Hauptmann, director of the German Archaeological Institute's Istanbul branch, partnered with Turkish archaeologists and turned the site into an official excavation area. Thus, Göbekli Tepe, one of the most significant discoveries in human history, began to emerge. As you can guess, this hill wasn't just an ordinary mound, as the early photos might suggest. Normally, when we say hill, we mean a small elevation formed naturally over thousands of years by the accumulation of dust carried by wind or water. But hills like Göbekli Tepe form for a different reason, because they contain ancient human settlements within them. Over generations, as these settlements filled with dust and new layers were built on top by the people living there, the land gradually rose, forming a mound. What you see today at Göbekli Tepe, the excavated area of about 1,500 square meters, is only a small fraction of the site. The entire mound has a diameter of over 300 meters and covers an area of about 8 hectares, roughly the size of 16 football fields. Yet, we can only see a very small part of it, since only that portion has been excavated so far. This limited excavation has led to various speculations on social media claims, like archaeologists are being stopped from digging further or aliens are being hidden beneath. However, such a situation is not unusual in archaeology. Excavations are often slow and selective to protect the integrity of ancient sites. Thanks to ground-penetrating radar technology, developed relatively recently, we now know that Göbekli Tepe is 5 to 10 times larger than the currently excavated area. On this map, the blue squares represent sites that have been partially or fully excavated, while the green dots indicate the famous T-shaped pillars that we'll see shortly. The black and white clusters, resembling ultrasound images, mark areas that haven't been excavated yet, but we know that beneath them lie the rest of Göbekli Tepe. So far, the most prominent structures we found are what archaeologists call enclosures, circular or oval structures, each 10 to 20 meters in diameter. At the center of each enclosure stand two massive T-shaped monolithic pillars, surrounded by 6 to 12 smaller T-shaped pillars arranged in a circle along the perimeter. You can see all of this in the site diagram. Each pillar stands 3.5 to 6 meters tall and weighs between 5 and 20 tons. The central pillars are noticeably larger and taller than the surrounding ones. Between some of the outer pillars, there are stone benches, places likely used for sitting. Archaeologists label these circular enclosures as A, B, C, D, and so on. So far, 9 major circular structures have been uncovered, with enclosures B, C, and D standing out as the best preserved. For example, what you see here is structure D. Using the same radar methods I mentioned earlier, we now know there are at least 20 more unexcavated circular structures and over 200 additional pillars still buried in the area. Carbon-14 analysis of carbonate and charcoal samples taken from different parts of the site indicates that Göbekli Tepe was built between 9,130 and 7,370 BCE. As I said before, Göbekli Tepe wasn't built all at once. It was rebuilt multiple times as it gradually became covered by dust and sediment over thousands of years. When we examine the pillars inside the circular structures, we see that many are decorated with animal reliefs, depictions of foxes, wild boars, lions, bulls, gazelles, hares, snakes, lizards, vultures, cranes, and owls. These choices make perfect sense given the environment of the time. However, not all animals appear equally often. Carvings of deer, ducks, and other useful animals are far more common than depictions of dangerous creatures like lions, snakes, spiders, or scorpions, a detail that will become important later. Most of these carvings, like the lion relief, are two-dimensional, but occasionally there are highly detailed three-dimensional sculptures as well. In addition, there are hand and arm motifs, as well as geometric patterns such as zigzags and chevrons. And, of course, human figures. For instance, in enclosure D, just to the right of a large duck carving, there's a headless male figure with an erect penis. But perhaps the most fascinating detail is this. The pillars weren't shaped like T merely for design, at least in enclosure D. The T shape appears to symbolize the human form. 2 of the central pillars are clearly sculpted to represent humans, complete with carved belts and loincloths. The top horizontal part of each T represents the head. So, at least some of these pillars are not just stone columns, they are statues. And who do these statues represent? We don't know. Because the genital areas of the statues are covered, it's actually impossible to determine their gender with certainty. However, since belts are depicted only on male figures and other artworks from the same period, it's generally believed that these pillars represent men. This assumption is further supported by the fact that among all the animal carvings whose gender can be identified, all but one are male. In fact, only one female figure has ever been found at Göbekli Tepe, and researchers believe it was added much later than the original carvings. Another crucial detail about the site's layout is that beyond the circular enclosures, there are also small adjoining chambers built right up against the outer walls. You can see traces of these box-shaped rooms in aerial photographs of the site. If you look closely, you'll notice that some of these small chambers have doors, allowing entry inside. Many are also interconnected, forming a complex network of narrow passages. Still, most archaeologists believe these structures were not living quarters, but rather platforms or elevated spaces where people could sit and participate in rituals held below. Now that we have a clearer understanding of what Göbekli Tepe is, we can finally turn to the bigger questions that have probably been on your mind. Don't underestimate our species' abilities. This is something very important to understand. We tend to look down on people of the Stone Age, but in reality, they were no different from us, neither in appearance nor in intelligence. They may not have had a culture as advanced as ours, but they still possessed a remarkably complex social structure. They pondered life after death, observed the stars, buried their dead, and crafted tools and jewelry. They simply lacked the level of science and technology we have today. They probably already had a sense of numbers, could communicate and exchange ideas, and likely had their own philosophers, inventors, and craftsmen. The main problem was that because they didn't live in permanent settlements, their culture was short-lived, passed only orally, from father to son and mother to daughter. That's not an efficient way for ideas or discoveries to spread and endure, so cumulative cultural development was extremely limited. But that was about to change with Göbekli Tepe and the transition to a settled way of life. In short, we need to stop imagining people who lived 10,000–12,000 years ago as primitive, ape-like beings. Of course, carving and moving massive stones without modern tools must have been difficult, but not impossible. Excavations have revealed limestone quarries within a few hundred meters to a couple of kilometers of Göbekli Tepe. Limestone happens to be one of the easiest stones to cut and shape, so the builders of Göbekli Tepe could likely carve the stones into pillars even without extremely hard tools and transport them a few hundred meters without much trouble. Even more convincingly, at these quarry sites, archaeologists found partially cut but unfinished stones, as well as tools like hammers and chisels used in their production. So we can say with 100% certainty that these monuments were made by humans. The next question, of course, is why? Why did our ancestors feel the need to build such a structure? The truth is, we still don't know exactly why the Neolithic people built Göbekli Tepe. There are three main theories about what Göbekli Tepe might have been. It was built either as a shelter, a temple, or as a kind of astronomical calendar, a tool to track important times of the year. But to evaluate these ideas properly, we first need to understand the people and the world of that era. So what were our ancestors doing each day back then? What did they think about? What were their fears and dreams? This period corresponds to the transition from hunter-gatherer life to early settled life, and, more importantly, it overlaps with the beginning of the agricultural revolution. Archaeologist Klaus Schmidt described that period as follows. Prehistoric people lived among herds of gazelles and other wild animals, drew water from gently flowing rivers, ate fruits and nuts, and watched seas of wild barley and wheat sway in the wind. To them, it was paradise. But, as with every paradise, there was also a hell. These ancestors of ours had to hunt powerful and dangerous animals using only primitive tools. Hunters were often trampled to death by herds of animals. Even the places they lived and slept in were deadly. Snakes, scorpions, wolves, bears, extreme heat and cold, storms, earthquakes, lightning, floods, all common causes of death. Add to that drought, hunger, infectious diseases, thirst, and injuries, everyday threats in a world without medicine. Even childbirth was a gamble. Mothers who were lucky survived, others didn't. And they also faced human problems that we still recognize today: conflict within tribes, coordination failures, jealousy, rivalry, and wars between neighboring groups. That's why we must stop imagining these people as primitive cave dwellers. They too feared death, searched for meaning, and felt the same need to express their emotions and existence that we do today. In that sense, Göbekli Tepe can be seen as a manifestation of those inner emotions and existential reflections. Even though they still lived as hunter-gatherers, they were beginning to notice that the seeds they scattered into the soil could grow into food. This realization that they didn't have to constantly wander in search of sustenance sparked the first steps toward agriculture and settled life. They started to build fields, protect them with fences, and for the first time, stay in one place. Once humanity settled down, culture could accumulate, especially in fertile regions like Mesopotamia, leading to an explosion of civilization. That exponential progress still continues today. The AI revolution we're living through is, in a sense, an echo of that same spark. When our ancestors first struck two stones together to make a spearhead, and later learned to pass on that knowledge to the next generation in a stable way, history began. That's why Göbekli Tepe holds such a special place among all archaeological discoveries. It offers a window into the lives of those who stood at the very dawn of human civilization. For this reason, Göbekli Tepe is sometimes described as the beginning of time, not in a physical sense, but in a cultural sense. And as the channel Kurzgesagt once suggested, perhaps we should start counting time not from the birth of Christ, but from Göbekli Tepe. If we take 10,000 BCE as year zero, then today would be the year 12,024, a timeline that might actually describe humanity's journey more accurately. In any case, we must never forget where we came from and the value of what our ancestors unknowingly created for us. The transition to settled life, of course, didn't happen overnight. At first, hunter-gatherer tribes built temporary shelters and rest stops like primitive caravanserais to stay in during migrations. And this is where the most widely supported theory about Göbekli Tepe comes in. It may have been a seasonal meeting point, a social hub, or a ritual site where different groups came together at certain times of the year. Considering the massive scale of Göbekli Tepe, it's unlikely that it was the first such stop. If this meeting place theory is correct, there must have been smaller sites built earlier. Indeed, since Göbekli Tepe's discovery, several similar but smaller sites, Hamzan Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, and Taşlı Tepe have been found nearby. Their simpler structures and locations suggest that Göbekli Tepe may have served as the central or main gathering place among them. This shelter theory actually connects to the other two theories as well. Just as today, in that time too, spiritual beliefs, though not necessarily organized religions, were a central part of social life. Many of the animal carvings and symbols might represent fears of death, existential anxieties, or beliefs about life after death, the very same themes that would later evolve into religion. Therefore, it's likely that Göbekli Tepe wasn't built for a single purpose. If people gathered there at specific times of the year, perhaps around equinoxes, they might have used the stars to track those moments and align their structures accordingly. Not every ancient site with astronomical alignment needs to involve aliens. Our ancestors looked like us, thought like us, and dreamed like us. They probably rested in those small chambers, and in the center, around those towering T-shaped pillars, they performed rituals. Klaus Schmidt himself described Göbekli Tepe as the temple on the hill, a place of worship that people might have traveled up to 150 kilometers to reach. As he famously said, first came the temple, then the city. There's evidence supporting this idea. For instance, the carvings on the pillars rarely show scenes of group hunting or wounded animals. And as mentioned earlier, harmless animals, deer, ducks, are depicted far more often than dangerous ones like snakes or spiders. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe was a sacred, purified space. Some researchers even believe the roots of shamanic belief systems began here. Perhaps there wasn't yet a clear concept of gods, but people trying to make sense of death and the unknown might have begun to imagine higher powers or spiritual forces. This could explain early myths later seen in Sumerian culture, such as the idea that agriculture and craftsmanship were divine gifts brought from a sacred mountain called Ekur. However, not all archaeologists agree with this interpretation. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe are highly naturalistic. We don't yet see the kind of mythical hybrid creatures or symbolic exaggerations that appear in later religious art. The animals seem to reflect the real environment of the builders, suggesting a decorative or artistic purpose rather than a purely religious one. Still, some carvings do exaggerate certain animals, such as a scorpion the size of a small bag, clearly not realistic. Such details might indicate that people believed in the protective power of strong animals, even if these symbols weren't yet part of a unified mythological system. Could Göbekli Tepe have been a permanent settlement? No. Unlike other Neolithic sites, there's no evidence of everyday life, no pottery, ovens, hearths, garbage pits, or fertility figurines. Only tools for cutting and carving stone were found. Its architecture also doesn't resemble a residential site. According to archaeozoologist Joris Peters, who analyzed over 100,000 animal bones from the site since 1998, almost all the animals eaten at Göbekli Tepe were wild, showing that domestication and farming hadn't yet begun. Therefore, it couldn't have been a permanent habitation site. One of the most fascinating discoveries is that some chambers were deliberately buried by humans. People intentionally covered them with soil. This, of course, has fueled numerous conspiracy theories, But research shows that some of the filling was likely natural, caused by rain and erosion over centuries. In other cases, people might have used soil from new construction to fill older chambers, suggesting that some rooms lost their function and were abandoned or replaced over time. Either way, we know for certain that humans deliberately buried part of Göbekli Tepe. But why? We still don't know. And that's where things stand. There are still many unanswered questions about Göbekli Tepe. The meanings of certain carvings may have been obvious to those who made them, but to us, they remain a mystery. We still don't fully understand how nomadic people organized themselves to build such a massive site. If no one lived there permanently, could the animal carvings have served as totems or protective symbols against evil spirits? We simply don't know. What we do know is that around 7,000 BCE, roughly 2,000–3,000 years after its construction, Göbekli Tepe began to lose its importance. People stopped building new pillars and eventually abandoned the site entirely. For thousands of years, this extraordinary monument slept beneath the soil, until, at last, it was rediscovered, and forever changed our understanding of what it means to be human.